Okay, so thank you very much, Gershon, for the comments. And I think you point to a lot of sort of important features of the paper. I think let me start backwards with what I think is the most fundamental of the issues you raise, which is the possible coexistence of these two motivations. And I think that's an important one to acknowledge, and certainly I don't certainly want to acknowledge that, right? So farmers who have the kinds of utility functions that we sort of estimate them to have are farmers who should be prudent in this context and who would have an insurance type of motivation. I think in terms of what drives the relationship between good draws and bad draws, I think what we show then should be interpreted as the dominance of a learning motivation in driving the relationship between actual realizations and people's subsequent decisions. So in terms of sort of empirical importance, how the history of people's returns relates to their subsequent choices seems to be dominated by this learning mechanism rather than the insurance one. But that's certainly not to say that the insurance one doesn't exist and that interventions on those lines couldn't also have potentially important effects. So I certainly agree with that comment. I think let me address just a few of the technical comments, and I look forward to the wider comments as well. So you raise an interesting set of challenges around the fact that farmers apply these inputs, or are supposed to apply these inputs, just to a couple of acres on their farms, and they do indeed generally have more than these two. Having more than two is in fact a prerequisite for membership in the program. So I think I wouldn't say that we're assuming that they apply these inputs only to these two. In fact, I think for us this is a bit of a black box. We want to allow that farmers use this set of inputs in whatever way they see best, and that might mean following the instructions and applying them on the two, or it might mean spreading them evenly around their farm. If it is even spreading them evenly around their farm, and we looked at returns on the 2 acres only, I think we could miss a substantial part of the story in terms of the economic impacts. And that sort of drives our motivation for looking at impacts across the farm. After all, as well, if farmers sort of shift labor from their other parcels onto the 2 parcels, even if they use them exclusively, we might overstate the benefits, right? So all of a sudden, these 2 acres look like a really good place to spend my time now that they have all this fertilizer on them, and I take labor away from the rest of my farm. And if I just looked at those 2, I'd miss some of the opportunity cost story. So we've attempted to look at the sort of the whole story on the sort of overall impact, while being agnostic about what farmers might be doing. Your point about profits is of course important. Profits are of course harder to measure than this output, which in this context is measured very precisely through farmers' passbooks. We compute profit and impacts on profit by testing for impacts on labor and other input use. We find very small changes in the other inputs that farmers use. So it looks like the output impacts net of the cost of the project look very close to the actual profits in as far as we can measure them here. You also mentioned the story about selection in the first instance. So how do people sort of confronted with something entirely new, who are the people who enter into this and who are the people who don't? And I agree, I think that's an interesting and in a way slightly different question, right? So this probably has a lot more to do with people's attitudes towards risk, their education, who are the people who think that they can sort of take these things on in an environment of relatively little information. I think that's an important question and one that we don't address here. We don't use it empirically because we're in the sort of unusual position, as you noted, of having this foreknowledge of people's adoption decisions that gives us something that would blow up our propensity score estimate, since it's a perfect predictor of who opts in and who opts out, and gives us a sort of, at least under assumptions about time invariance, allows us to match not only on observed characteristics, but even on the unobserved drivers of why people opt in. I think those are the main ones which I wanted to focus on. Groups versus individuals. Yeah, so this is in fact something that I've looked at separately. So I agree that if learning is important, we should certainly expect that. I mean, not to the exclusion of learning from oneself, but one should also take into account information that one gets from others. We should probably document it in this context. I find very little impact of similar measures of realizations of gains by one's peers, either in the group or in the village as a whole, on either decisions to sustain adoption or on the belief measures as a sort of direct measure of the learning. So it doesn't look to be terribly important here, which might be consistent with the idea that this heterogeneity that we observe along observable dimensions is in fact persistent and important. Right? So one of the points of the Munchie paper is that people will learn a lot less and much more slowly from their peers if heterogeneity if persistent heterogeneity is important. And this might be a context in which persistent heterogeneity is a part of the story. But we don't seem to see a big story there. In a way, of course, it would be difficult, and we do in some robustness checks, or I have in some robustness checks tried to controlled for it. The concern with peers outcomes is that they also affect, given the liability structure, affect what happens to the group as a whole, and could lead people to drop out because I don't want to support my friend who has a bad realization just as much as I drop out because I think that I'm going to have a worse realization given what I see happens to him or her. But I think those are certainly important points, and we should raise this learning from peers thing more directly in the paper as well. Or you check? Yeah.
If there are any questions from the room, Andrew's going to answer them now, and please just wait for the microphone to come to you, and so that people online can hear you.
Thanks. I think it's a very interesting paper and well presented. I want to ask a little bit about your interpretation of the findings on the effects of realizations of output under the previous technology, and the interpretation of what that means for sort of current adoption, because under your sort of insurance model, you expected that effect to be positive. So if you had a positive shock under the previous technology, you could have accumulated more income, and that would have made you sort of in a better position to take the risk to adopt this new technology. I think that's how you describe it. But instead, you find sort of the opposite direction of that effect. But I wonder whether or not that also could still be consistent with a lack of access to insurance, in the sense that people could have, there's still some learning. I mean, this is a little bit under Gershen's story, that there may be sort of both things going on, but people have a bad draw under the old technology. They update their priors on whether or not they're any good at that, or their own heterogeneous returns are low for that technology. And then there's a sort of loss aversion going on. They're trying to get out of it. If they had been insured against that risk, then you wouldn't necessarily see that relationship. But with the absence of insurance, they're actually driven away from the old technology towards what's now available.
Taking several.
Two questions. It could be I'm confused, but when you talk about risk aversion, you don't have any measure of risk aversion in the paper. So you cannot control for that, and you cannot make any argument about it. They could have, within heterogeneity, you can have a lot of issues going on in terms of the relative risk aversion, which could be explaining the decisions they made. So I was a little bit worried with your third conclusion, because unless I understood something wrong, but you don't have a measure of this reasonable risk. You're assuming they have similar levels. So that was one question. The second question on the who were the first innovators, how you control for the spillovers because one thing is for me to have my village being affected by the entry and taking that year, but really innovators can get information through spillovers. So it depends on when the technology was first started, somewhere close by. And I don't see in your equations any control for spatial autocorrelation or nothing that will allow me to assure that there is not an effect on that. And then on your probability estimates, why there were no marginal effects there? Those were basically the coefficients. And then you include a lag variable within the equation. What happened with your estimation? You maintain the same simple probability, or something will affect by the inclusion of this lag variable within the explanatory variables?
I have a question which is related to the previous questions, but I want to know more about who those people or farmers who did not adopt. which leads to my related question of what's the old technology, what's the counterfactual. We are saying that they have distributed this high-tech package combination of improved seed, fertilizer, insecticide, and so forth. But what is the combination of old technologies that they were adapting before? And it might have implication of how easy or how difficult it is to go back to the old technology. So maybe I missed it out in the earlier presentation, but a little bit clarification of that would be really good. Thanks.
Yes, I just had a quick follow-up for your point about the influence of groups on the adoption process. I was wondering if you were able to, or if you're looking into controlling for the size of the social network or the size of the group. I'm not sure if it was just a binary variable you were using, or if there's a way to control for that, seeing if there's an inverse relationship or what kind of relationship there is.
Take those. Okay, so I guess taking those in order, and thank you for the comments. I think there's a number of important points there. Dan, on your point about the realizations under the old technology, so I guess we might think of that as if there were insurance under the old technology, that would change the distribution of returns there. I don't know if that would, you would probably offer people insurance which would apply irrespective of their technology, so not just to the old technology or just to the new one. I'd have to think in particular about whether insuring the old technology would shift the way people act. But I think that's in a way what we're arguing against, that the bad draws under the old technology are operating mostly through this learning effect, right? So if farmers are sort of prudent in this sense, those bad draws should make them less willing to opt into this new technology. And I think so. Yes, in a way, sort of making it less risky in general, or making just that outcome less risky would clearly sort of, well, I would think the first order effect of that would be to make the old technology more appealing if that was sort of operating specifically on the distribution of outcomes there. But I have to think a little bit more about that. It's an interesting point. Maximo, you mentioned two things, I think. One on the control for risk aversion. So I think our story is that given their levels of risk aversion and given the distribution of potential outcomes of yields here, even if everybody has the same level of risk aversion, it is a level and a degree of prudence, or under this hypothesis, which we don't find strong evidence for, it may be a level of prudence which would be sufficient for people to be driven out by bad draws. Right? We don't necessarily need people to have heterogeneous levels of risk aversion within this population in order to have either one of these stories. It could be everybody with the same degree of risk aversion and reacting to different news, which is what sort of driving this empirical relationship. We could, in our estimates, when we do the structural approach, we could allow risk aversion to vary in this population rather than estimating, sort of assuming everybody has the same preferences. And that would allow us to correlate those estimates based on realized decisions with estimates that we can get from independent laboratory measures of risk aversion and things like that. And I think that exercise of seeing whether there is consistency across sort of lab experimental and this field setting domains might be an interesting exercise. Whether it's something to control for, on the other hand, since we have this sort of comparable set of individuals, at least when we're estimating impacts, right? We have this comparable set of individuals. Everybody we're looking at when we construct the sort of counterfactual for people who adopt are people who are themselves early adopters. The presumption is that if risk aversion matters, it doesn't change very much, and there's a consistent relationship between the level of risk aversion and adoption across years. Your second set of concerns relates to spillovers here. So I think, I didn't say so explicitly, but probably should have. We're being quite cautious, although I'm not agnostic about the structure of it, when we think about what kinds of correlation there might be in outcomes here. So we're clustering everything at the village level, allowing even for correlations in outcomes across years here. When I look at, and similarly in looking at the disadoption choices of adopters, we're allowing for correlated choices within groups. So as a question of inference, I hope that deals with most of it, but if you're unsatisfied by that, I'm happy to talk further. You were right to point out that I think I skipped over giving you the marginal effects in the presentation, so I'm sorry for that. The implication here is that something like a standard deviation change in your draw, so whether you have a good experience or bad experience, corresponds to about a 7 percentage point change in the probability of staying in the program. And given that we have something like 30% of farmers dropping out, that seems like it's a potentially important amount of dropout that might be explained by the heterogeneity which we observe here. But thank you for raising that. I'm sorry to have skipped over it. You raised something about lag variables in the probit, but I want to be careful there. So we have historical measures of your output realizations, but we're looking at the decision to stay with the program among a population of people who have adopted it. So when it's the standard sort of lag dependent variable kind of concerns, which I think you're raising, would apply especially if you were worried about restricting this analysis to adopters. But there's nothing like sort of fixed effects going on or those kinds of things, or lag dependent variables in the normal specification in the way that we normally worry about it there. Then there were a couple of, just finally, there were the questions about sort of non-adopters and the learning processes. I think these are both very interesting as well. So, so I think our challenge here is that the process of initial experimentation is in a way a different process than the process of learning, and what might drive the choice to adopt in the long run could be different than this initial experimentation. I think it's an important and possibly separate set of things to do. I can say that I think, well, I'd be speculating, I haven't looked at it in some time. I think that people who are doing well are more likely to adopt, in the sense of having gotten positive output draws in the year before they're visited by the program. So I can say a few things that positive income shocks seem to work in that way, but I'm recalling something that I haven't looked at in a little while. But it's an important, and I hope somewhat separate set of questions. Similarly, the size of social networks and groups, I think, is an interesting thing to look at. So we collected a lot of social network data as part of this project. And I think there are two kinds of social network measures which might matter here. One is the group itself. So you're in this contract, you sign up with a bunch of people, and those groups are relatively uniform in size. Then there is also sort of a less formal social network, people you have contact with or live nearby or farm nearby, and information might diffuse across either of those channels. So in looking at this learning from peers story, which Gershon raised, we've looked for learning across either of those network measures and don't find strong impacts there. But if you have other thoughts about what would be interesting to explore in that part of the data, I'm curious to hear them.
Well, you mentioned a few things, but I was just wondering if you could give other examples of what these sources of essential heterogeneity might be.
One more as well. You may have mentioned this, I may not have heard it, but were you at all controlling for household size or other sources of income at the household level?
Okay. So let me just mention on the essential heterogeneity, because it gives me an opportunity to say a couple of things. So our, for reasons I can describe a bit more if you're interested, but for reasons, our sort of preferred estimates of the correlates of heterogeneity, and bearing in mind we're only estimating this for reasons related to the identification strategy in the first year of experimentation. So we can't say much about whether this was just a bad draw, or say a good draw, a year in which this was a good technology for old trees, or if this is always a good technology for old trees, for example. But we seem to see, so in terms of things that you might think are sort of intrinsic, old trees seem to benefit more. The amount of land dedicated to the technology, so this also relates to whether people are using it just on that spot or are diffusing it. The agronomist would tell us that spreading it too thinly actually should diminish the returns, but obviously there are sort of socio or economic things that go on as well for large farmers, but large farmers seem to be benefiting more, and we have this puzzle that the returns for women are so much less than they are for men, for reasons that we don't have any direct evidence on what's going on there. We'd like to be able to see to what extent heterogeneity is driven by bad implementation, and you might think that some of these are correlated with the quality of input use that people do. And that relates to one of your concerns as well. That's not something that we can answer with these data, I think, because it's quite tricky, and for program reasons, they don't want to tell you if they've sort of not obeyed the instructions very well or deviated from what they were supposed to be doing. And then I think you raise an important set of interests, or set of concerns, which is that sort of household size and other sources of heterogeneity might also be correlated with reasons why I stay in the program or don't stay in the program. So when we show the relationship between these shocks as you join the program to your choice to stay with it, we control for all these observed correlates of heterogeneity, and those results hold up as well.
Can I raise one more question? While you have this table on the board, there's a huge parameter on the lagged cocoa output. What is your interpretation of this parameter? 680 kilogram less for every kilo of old output?
So, yeah, I think, so this is suggesting that people who had done very, very poorly, perhaps, I think this is probably proxying for a number of agronomic problems which are imperfectly measured in the data, like pestilence and the like, that are addressed by insecticides and fungicides and aspects of the program here. So I think these are farmers who have bad things going on their farms, which are picked up in particular by this program. And this is where it's important. I didn't talk too much about the specification here, but we allow not only for this interaction with your current membership, but allow the same characteristics to interact with whether you are an early adopter in general, to address a possible concern you may have that this is just picking up something like mean reversion or something like this. And so that, if so, I think that would be driven by the interaction with the early adopter characteristic rather than the actual treatment in particular.
Was that definition of early adopter has a decision already that could be a result of the spillover. Okay, because within your 1 year range or definition, there could be already an spillover which you are by definition capturing. And that's my worry of the spillover. I don't think you are cleaning that and you're not controlling for that. And that could affect a lot of the results. So have you done any robustness check of your definition of early adopter? Any variation of the definition of early adopter that allows you to assure that the results keep consistent?
Okay, so I'm not sure there's a couple possible, just to understand for clarification. So there's a couple ways in which you might worry about that spillover, I suppose. So you're thinking that if a lot of my neighbors, let me know if this is what you mean. Is it that if a lot of my neighbors adopt, or people in my village adopt, then this is going to impact my likelihood of adopting in the future? Or I'm not sure what is the spillover channel you have in mind?
I am an innovator. Okay? I would be looking around what are the technologies that I use to be an early adopter. Okay, so it could, like another village already have the program, could immediately influence my rate of adoption.
So we worry about cross-village externalities.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's for me spillover, not within. So it's basically I'm capturing the learning from other people, and given that I am less risk averse, I want to take I will immediately become, and you are categorizing those people in certain way within your type of definition. So the only thing I'm saying is, given that you are making that variable, you need to do some robustness check around it, because the way you are making that variable is kind of endogenous to potential spillovers around from other districts. And your clustering is only at the district or the village level. So you are not capturing, and you are not measuring any spatial autocorrelation across. So you are not controlling the potential influence from other districts coming in.
Sure. So, I mean, apart from noting that our sampling strategy is such that these villagers in our sample are quite far away, I mean, I think if it was true that, so where I think your concern bites in particular is that in order for our identification strategy to give us a purchase here, at least in the cross-sectional differences, we're assuming that the to the extent that people select in on time invariant characteristics, that selection process is stable over time. So it might be that in early years, for example, when this program, near the time that this program just started, they were especially risk-loving people who opted in, and in later years, they were different in some way, and that would cause problems for the construction of a counterfactual. That's where our estimates, which have individual level fixed effects, get us some degree further. So we in fact have a much weaker set of assumptions when we exploit the fact that some of these individuals are viewed in multiple periods of time. That allows us to at least soften those restrictions. The other thing we can do, and gets to your robustness point, is we can look to see whether the estimated returns differ when we run those estimates separately across different years, right? And that might be driven by actual changes in the returns to those adopters or different selection processes. And we don't see any difference in the estimated returns across years within our rounds of the data. And I think that partly addresses your second concern. Okay, well, thank you all so much for your comments. This was really useful. Yeah.